Hi, Peter Charles here, Folk Fly Fishing. And one of my subscribers recently suggested that I discuss the differences between fiberglass and graphite rods and where we might want to use one over the other. So I thought that was a rather good subject, especially since I have a really old fiberglass rod right here. This one I bought with my paper money when I was a teenager. So it's well over 50 years old. And it still casts well. In fact, so well, take a look at this little bit of footage of me putting it out to the backing knot. It's an 80-foot fly line. And it could cast an 80-foot fly line, a cheap, generic fly line, and cast it out to the backing knot. You know, I won't want to be casting like this on the flats for bonefish, that's for sure. But obviously, even this cheap fiberglass rod that the price point was so low, a kid with his paper money could buy it. It can still cast quite a distance. So really, what is the difference? Why would we want one over the other? Why did the industry move from fiberglass to graphite? What was driving it? Well, the primary difference between graphite and fiberglass is in something called modulus, which is its resistance to deformation. So in other words, how much can we bend it or how much can we stretch it under the same load? And graphite has a higher modulus than fiberglass. And so it essentially means you can use less of it and get, the same bend, or use more and get, a stiffer bend, but in doing so, it was lighter. A lot lighter than fiberglass, so you could use less material. And fiberglass is very strong. It's got a lot of durability in it, but it didn't have the same modulus, the same resistance to bending. And so as a consequence, if you wanted to make it stiffer, you had to put a lot of material in it. I've owned 4 fiberglass rods. I've had 2 of these Blanchard Algonquins. And I also had a rod, a little newer vintage. It was a Shakespeare Wonder Rod, I think it's called. I don't have it anymore. It was the white fiberglass. Some of you might remember that model. And it was very stiff compared to other rods. In fact, it was easily as stiff as the average graphite rod today. And it just wasn't very pleasant to cast. I didn't like it at all. It was a bit of a pool cue. So it showed you what would happen if you try to push the stiffness too much in graphite by building up the material. It started to degrade on the performance and made it less pleasant to use. The other fiberglass rod I had was a Hardy, a newer Hardy that was 6.5 foot 3-weight. I had it about 20 years ago. And it was designed for small creek work, and that worked lovely too. It was a great rod for very short distances. So modulus is part of the package. Weight is another one. But that is, it can work in favor of us as well as, be a penalty. A heavy rod like this old Blanchard compared to this newer NRX Plus, the weight difference between these is significant. In terms of the distance, yes, the NRX Plus will cast farther, but it's not going to cast a whole lot farther because there's limitations in the lines themselves. Just the resistance of getting the running line out of the water, for example, will suck energy out of the cast, and it doesn't matter whether you're using a cheap rod or a very expensive rod. A lot of things like that resistance is going to, lessen the cast of that expensive rod that can really cast quite far if we didn't have that resistance. So there are some practical things that limit casting distance more, and of course there's our casting ability too, of course, that limit how much we can get out of a rod. So under ideal circumstances, the NRX Plus will way outcast that old fiberglass rod. But, when we're fishing, is there that much of a difference going on? When we're dealing with wind, we're dealing with the resistance of we're dealing with issues with the flies and leaders and all the different things that can negatively affect our distance you know, in the end, it's not a huge difference between, a rod like this and a rod like that. So where do we gain? Well, as I said, I've talked about weight. You get a significantly heavier swing weight with fiberglass, and you really have to be in tune with it, because if you're not in tune with it, it goes to pot very quickly. But if you get in tune with it, you can turn it to your advantage. That heavy swing rate comes with a very heavy tip weight, so the tip feels like you're waving a big weight on the end of that rod, and it almost is self-energizing. So in other words, you almost don't need a fly line on it. I have a very old graphite rod. It's first generation graphite. It's pretty heavy for a graphite rod, and it has a very heavy tip. And as a consequence, it self-loads. It has that same characteristic. And you can actually just cast the leader of your rig. You don't have to have fly line out of the tip. You just have to hang a 9-foot leader out, and it will cast it properly because the weight of that tip self-loads the rod. Fiberglass rods do the same. That heavy swing weight gives you that self-energizing, which makes them quite good at short distance. So if you're looking for a short distance solution, that's the reason why I had that Hardy 6.5-foot 3-weight. That self-energizing capability of just the weight of the tip will load the rod meant you could get some really lovely short casts out of it. Now, the NRX 3-weight I have is, can cast short quite well, without that extra weight. So you can say to yourself, well, do we really need it? If you look at the rods of the quality of that NRX, I mean, the tip is so beautifully responsive that I can make very short casts with that rod without any problem. So fiberglass rods will give you a certain benefits at short distance compared to a lot of other rods. The other thing they'll do is they really are slow to cast. They're slow to respond compared to graphite. That's one of the impacts of modulus. This, when this thing bends, it recovers like a rocket. Not this one. It's a very slow, in comparison, it's a very slow recovery rate. So that difference in recovery rate makes a difference, especially when we're dealing with wind and big flies and heavy lines and everything else. The recovery rate does make it easier for us. But if you can get in tune with the casting motion of an old fiberglass rod, an old heavy fiberglass rod, they will go quite far. They can really chuck a lot of line. And the newer fiberglass rods tend to be a bit lighter, but nevertheless, they can't get away from that low modulus. So it's very much, when you're working with a fiberglass rod, it's very much like a first generation graphite rod, in that they are relatively heavy, they have high swing weights, they do have that self-energizing capacity because the tips are so heavy. Just the motion of the rod will tend to load them. As I say, why would we want to go out and fish them? Well, there's a certain nostalgic aspect to it. You might just like the action of a fiberglass rod. As long as it's not like that white Wonder Rod that I had, which was a pool cue, as long as it's not something like that, you may really enjoy that slow action. I had an opportunity to cast a 15-foot 1011 Hardy fiberglass rod, and it was actually very interesting to cast as long as I slowed down and didn't try to, muscle the thing. It was actually quite pleasant. So they have some benefits, but I think really, if you get down to it, the modern rods with their faster recovery rates, much faster recovery rates, their lightness and their ease of casting, over a long day's fishing, you'll appreciate the graphite rod. If you're dealing with you like that slow, lazy action, like in my video, I mean, I'm not really going very quickly. I'm just rocking backwards and forwards and letting the rod go. If you like that sort of casting and that sort of action, fiberglass rod, modern fiberglass rod will deliver it. They're quite a lot of fun to use. As I say, though, they are heavier. The swing weights are heavier. You'll notice it. So if you are not in tune with it, they can beat you up. But as I say, getting down to it, the bottom line, it isn't so much a distance issue. It's more of a, what do we like in the way of a rod action? How do we like to cast? And also, can you manage the swing weight difference? And can you manage the recovery rate difference? Certain types of casts, certain types of situations that it may not deliver. For example, a strong headwind, you might find it easier to get going with a graphite rod than a fiberglass rod. Different scenarios where the graphite will come into play, and it will be a superior fishing tool. Bottom line is, a lot of it's personal preference. I don't fish graphite. Sorry, I don't fish fiberglass. Get it right. Except for this old Blanchard, take it out once in a while to get wet, but I wouldn't buy one. It's just not my cup of tea, really. I've moved on, but I mean, as I say, fiberglass rods, they still work. They're still effective fishing tools if they're designed properly and they're built properly, and you can still have a ton of fun with them. So, as I say, it boils down to preference. That's really what it is. And as I say, the graphite rod, we wouldn't be using them if they weren't better fishing tools. The bottom line, they are better fishing tools, but the fiberglass rod will hold its own in the right hands. So, that's basically the difference, is modulus and weight, and how that ends up feeling in your hands. Cheers.